Good morning and welcome to another week of Coastal Drone Weekly Live. This is our 12th episode for 2024. And this week we're going to be talking about drone mapping. My name's Ian. I've got Jen with me and Finn. First off, let's talk about what is drone mapping. Then we're going to talk about the essential components of a drone map, some applications, and how to get started. We're talking about aerial data. Finn, you were talking about remote sensing before we started here. But the purpose of this is to take images and either create 2D or 3D maps that are then geo-rectified to a known reference point on the surface of the Earth. The maps are created by combining a series of images captured from a top-down perspective, or nadir, with at least some overlap of visibly distinct features. So you can't build a map of 2 or 3 or 4 different images all over the place. They have to be overlapped over top of each other, and there has to be some sort of common reference point between the images that can be used to tie these images together. At minimum, typically like 70% of overlap is what's needed. Also, these images have to have GPS data embedded in them in order to help with the positional accuracy of each of these images in both a relative and in an absolute sense. So by relative, I mean if image A is here and image B is here and image C is here, that it has the ability to measure distance and place them in kind of coordinated clustered space. And an absolute accuracy as well, where on the Earth are they, so that it can then be known that this map would tie to a point. So let's get some essential components out of the way. Well, what do you need essentially first? You need a camera, and ideally the camera needs to fly so it can have an aerial perspective. So a drone is a great place to start. Ideally, it's going to have high resolution. It's going to have a really good GPS built into the drone, and preferably either a global or mechanical shutter. And what a global or mechanical shutter is when it takes an image. Your smartphone, most cameras at the consumer level have something called a rolling shutter. And it's kind of like a photocopier. When you watch the scan head move across a plate of glass, that's a rolling shutter. It's scanning progressively from one side of the glass to the other. Or in this case, inside the sensor that is your camera, it's scanning from the top to down to the bottom. Why does that matter? Well, drones are usually moving when they're taking pictures out of maps. So if you've got your camera frame of reference moving, and you try and take a picture, if the shutter speed isn't high enough, if the drone isn't still enough, that image is going to warp, right? Just like if you take a shaky picture with your camera. So a global shutter takes the entire image all at once, and that way it prevents that warping or that distortion. So it's going to make a better camera for mapping. You're going to need software to combine these images into either a flat 2D image, which is an ortho mosaic, or a mosaic of ortho rectified photos, or a 3D model, which is photogrammetry. And then you're going to need some sort of means to geo-reference these images, which means taking an image that is of a location on the planet and saying, this image must fall on top of this known set of coordinates on the planet. So that means either surveying a point on the ground using a known pin or surveyor's mark or a monument or a landmark, or using other tools like ground control points, which are either done in real time or done after the fact. We're going to get into that. So what are some good drones? Let's get the hardware out of the way first, right? So I've basically chosen 3 different tiers or 3 different points of drones that are going to be good for mapping at this point. And of course, they're all DJI for the scope of this. So the Mini 3 Pro is a great drone to start out with mapping. First off, it's relatively cheap. It's under $1,500 Canadian, typically. You don't need a pilot certificate to fly it in Canada because it's under 250 grams. It's easy to get. You can buy them at pretty much any retail store, Amazon, Best Buy, London Drugs here in Canada. And they're not limited to just drone mapping, right? They've got a 4K video camera on them. They can shoot vertical video. They're great for travel. They're easy to pack. They're tiny. So they're really good as a starter drone for mapping. One of the main reasons the Mini 3 Pro over all other micro drones is the Mini 3 Pro has access to DJI's software development kit, which means third-party apps can control the drone and tell the drone what to do, which is a critical part. You need to be able to fly autonomously when you're doing mapping to get the best and most consistent results. Some downsides to the Mini especially, is the resolution of the camera these days is a little low. It's only 12 megapixels. It does have that rolling shutter we were talking about where it scans as it images. So there's a bit more distortion. It's not a deal breaker. Being a micro drone, being only 250 grams or less, it does have a lower wind resistance compared to the other ones. So it relies on the software development kit that the drone has, but you do need to have an additional device. So there's an extra cost. You have to have an Android tablet or phone in order to control the drone using these software.
But this is a micro drone.
Yes.
And that's, I would say, probably the biggest advantage of this. You're less concerned about bystanders. You're less concerned about airspace.
Yeah.
And you did mention that you don't need a certificate, but I would say that the bystanders and the airspace considerations are more relevant to the micro drone pilot. We're going to talk about some scenarios later down the road, but some of the scenarios might be industrial inspection or construction sites or something like this, where or building inspections, where you as the pilot and the person who you're hiring, they may not be able to guarantee that the site is sterile of bystanders. Ultimately, if you're able to mitigate that by using a micro drone where you have a little bit more flexibility, we're not saying to fly directly over people's heads and hover over people's heads, but it definitely gives you a bit more flex in that scenario.
That's a good point. To bring this into context, so this, everything you're saying is for Canada. Mm-hmm. In the States, near people, over cars, there's not really a weight limit on it because it comes down to the category 1 through 4. Mm-hmm. And the Mini 3 Pro doesn't qualify as a category 1 drone because it doesn't have prop guards. All of that, what that means is you have to have a Part 107 license because for 2 reasons. If you're doing mapping, you're probably doing it for commercial use. So you need a Part 107 for that. If you're flying over people, you need a Part 107 license.
So also, if someone has a last-minute mapping mission for you and it's in controlled airspace in Canada, Class C airspace, or similarly controlled airspace, and you need either from Canada, it would be nav drone permission. In the States, it's Lance C permission. If this is like a just-in-time thing, a last-minute thing, it could take up to 72 hours to get your permission request approved. And especially if you're closer to an aerodrome or an airport or a heliport, it could take potentially even longer than that if there's some details to iron out, which it's all moot if you have a micro in Canada because you can just pop the aircraft up.
As long as it's not restricted or a NOTAM in place.
Yeah, as long as it's... So what I tell people is this drone can fly in Canada except where places where no aircraft in Canada can fly.
Yeah,
so
pretty much.
As long as an aircraft is legally allowed to fly in that airspace, you can shoot a mapping mission.
Yeah. The Mavic 3 Enterprise has a global shutter. So it's better suited for mapping. It has a much bigger sensor. It's a 4/3 size sensor. It does 20 megapixels. It's the same that's in the Mavic 3 Consumer Edition, the Pro, all of them. It's the same sensor. It's just they've changed the shutter. It can fly up to 9, even at 9 meters per second. That's one of the other minuses I should have mentioned for the Mini. It can only suitably really map at about 2 meters per second, which means it's going to take you more time to cover the same area that this drone would take to cover. And the reason it can fly faster is because of the shutter and the bigger sensor and the faster shutter speed that you can fly with. So that faster mapping speed means more acres covered in an hour, means more productivity, means potentially more dollars per hour that you're seeing in revenue. It has built-in mapping software because it's a enterprise drone. DJI has the Pro controller, and on the Pro controller, it has DJI Pilot 2, which you can plan out mapping missions right in the controller and or upload like a KML or a Google file to it, and then draw a box over an area of interest and then have it plan the mapping software built in. So you don't need to use a third-party Android tablet. You don't need to use additional software for it to map. It also has built-in hardware RTK support, and we'll talk more about RTK in a minute, but what that means is it has the ability to be very precise with its GPS information in real time, so it knows exactly where it is, not only relative to its position, but also in absolute to the surface of the Earth. Of course, one of the big downsides is cost. This thing is 4,800 Canadian and up, and it's kind of a one-trick pony. The Mavic 3 Enterprise has 2 lenses. It's designed for remote inspection is really the best use case for it. So it's got mapping capability at high speed and then inspecting cell towers, structure, infrastructure. Doesn't have any thermal capabilities. And the Mavic 3 Enterprise series, there's 3 different versions of Mavic 3. There's the Enterprise, which is this one, which is just really for mapping. There's the Thermal, which also looks like this, but has a different sensor payload with a smaller camera that is not great for mapping. It's closer to a Mini 3 camera. And then there's the multispectral, which has the same camera as this one for the RGB or photos, but then it also has another 4 bands for near infrared, blue, red edge, and infrared for the ability to take multispectral data.
That one's my favorite.
Yeah. And actually, it is in some ways better for mapping because it really is a true mapping drone, which you could use for this. But the cost is higher as well.
Yeah.
It's, I think, closer to $6,000. So like I said, it has the Enterprise series of DJI. The hardware is essentially all the same, but the software and the OS that they're running is very different. And so they've locked out video capabilities. On the Enterprise, it's only 4K at 30 frames a second. And it's only at a basic color profile. So it doesn't have any of the cinema or log video capabilities. But one of the big things that's cool about the Mavic 3 series is if you invest in the Mavic 3 series, you could build a fleet out of these drones and do that. They've done the same thing here now with the Mavic 3 series. They all use the exact same batteries. Propellers are the same. They take about the same size space. They fold down so you can have a bunch of these in your Pelican case and choose specifically which one makes sense for the job that you're doing. If you want something that's compact and portable, and most importantly, air transportable. The batteries are only 80 watt hours, so you can fly in an airplane with these. Moving up, we've got the Matrice 350 RTK. This is the current industrial enterprise drone that DJI offers. And so in a mapping specific context here, we've got the P1, the P1 is actually just the sensor. So that payload on the bottom is interchangeable. You can run different cameras or payloads on the Matrice platform. It's totally modular, but we're talking about the P1 here, which is a full frame camera. So it's a very large sensor. It takes up to 48 megapixels per photo. It is a global shutter. It's purpose built for mapping. It has a level of weather resistance, although I wouldn't really want to do mapping in poor weather because then you have the risk of water getting on the lens and distorting your images. You can change the lenses out so you can fly at the same altitude and change your field of view. So if you needed a wider or a tighter shot, which would then affect your ground resolution, you could do that. The platform has hot swap batteries, so you can land, take one battery out, put another one in, take the other battery out, put another one in, and not lose your GPS lock, so you can continue mapping faster and spend less time on the ground. And like I said, it's a multi-role drone platform. So you're buying a drone and then you're buying the sensor payload. So you could have one drone and then have a thermal payload, a mapping payload, a LiDAR payload, gas detection. All these different platforms are separate. The drone itself is roughly 15,000 Canadian. And then the camera payload for this one's roughly 9,000 to 10,000 Canadian. So the downside, of course, is the cost, right? This is a big investment, but this is something that you could buy the drone and keep the drone for probably 4 to 5 years and still be relevant. They're pretty stable platforms in terms of technology development. And even the last generation is almost identical in terms of capability. So you could use the 300 or the 350. One of the big downsides, though, is the batteries are huge. They're 230 watt hours. So there's no hope in hell that you're going to get these things on an airplane. So if you need to go to a remote job site, you're either ground shipping your batteries, renting batteries when you get there, or
you drive.
So that's where the Mavic 3 has a real advantage, I think. The other side of this, of course, like one of the core components is you need to geo-reference your images. So there's 2 different types of geo-referencing an image. And you'll hear the terms PPK and RTK. And so PPK is post-processing kinematic. And what that means is when you're collecting your images, you have either visible ground control points inside the images that have known GPS points, and then you correct for them, or you are using a time-corrected log of GPS data that is collected at the exact same time as the drone photos are collected, and then it's merged with the photos. So there's 2 ways you can do it. You can use these yellow checkerboards here. These are called propeller arrow points. And what they do is you lay them out on the ground. They're roughly a half a meter, but they're big. They're big enough that you lay them on the ground and they face the sun. They're solar powered. And each one of these has its own GPS antenna built into it. And what happens is it has a unique serial number, and it sits there for 45 minutes to an hour while you're mapping, and it gets a really good idea of where it is in GPS 3D space. That is then the drone will fly over top of it and get a picture of it and knows exactly where it is in the picture. And hopefully there's 12 or more pictures of the same point so that it can coordinate and draw that. You will have a minimum of 3 or 4 of these on a map. It will then use those 3 or 4 when it builds the entire map out to shift or align the collection of images to those points that are known. And you do that by taking the images, assigning the serial numbers of these propeller arrow points on the images. So if this one was point 1 had a latitude and a longitude and an elevation. Elevation is also very important because you need to know the datum point on the Earth, right? So, and the datum is a arbitrary line that is the spherical or ellipsoid height of, it's actually below ground in a lot of places. And this is going to get pretty deep into it, but DJI drones typically use WGS 84 or NAD, North American 1983, and that's a common reference point for elevation. So if I tell you I'm at 100 feet above sea level, but the datum point is either lower than the surface, right? So it's really important that we know how high something is as well as where it is. The where it is easier to figure out, but we have a course more about this stuff that goes into the depth and detail on this. The other way to do this is real-time kinematic. And RTK is basically a live connection between the drone or the surveying device, which is in this case is the drone, and a known fixed location. So that known fixed location is either going to be an augmented GPS that is at the survey location. And what's happening is the drone is talking to 14-ish satellites in real time. But those satellites have interference that comes from the ionosphere. So not every signal is not going to be perfectly timed and accurate. So that's going to create error. And without RTK, your GPS is only good for, let's say, 2 to 3 meters on the ground for precision. When you start using RTK, you're adding in that other known point that's like very low latency or very close to you. So it's got really good signal and very good timing. That's going to automatically bring your accuracy, your relative accuracy down to centimeters. And then if you know where that GPS is, because you've either surveyed that location and it's over top of a monument, or if it's using another reference to another known survey, like if you've got that relative positioning from something that's known at some point, then it's going to increase your absolute accuracy and also your positional. So you could be down to sub-centimeter level. What happens is it uses a protocol called NTRIP, or it's a network real-time connection. You have to have internet, you have to have cellular, you have to have some sort of connection to that protocol. So if you're in a super remote area, PPK is going to make more sense than using real-time connectivity.
I think for that, like in Metro Vancouver, we have a number of cell towers around here that can act as base stations. So then you wouldn't, because these base stations are actually quite expensive. But if you're in like a built up area like this, you could connect to the network, and you have to pay for that.
Yeah.
This is a paid service, but
monthly or hourly usually.
If you're showing up to a site, you don't have to survey to where the ground point is, because that information will be provided to you because you're paying for it. I think in Metro Van there's at least 2.
Oh, there's a ton, because so RTK is used not only for mapping and surveying but also for farming. You'll see like a lot of tractors have GPS receivers on top of them, and they look like survey grade GPSs because they're using RTK to be very precise about what lines they're doing.
The point is that like you can connect us like 3 or 4 towers. Your accuracy is going to be like millimeters.
All the photos you take with a drone when you're doing mapping, if you don't have some way to prove that that photo is in this specific point, they're nice pictures, but they're useless. There's a lot of software out there. Drone Deploy is probably one of the bigger ones out there, right? So Drone Deploy is a cloud-based platform first and foremost. So it's actually more than just mapping. It's got mission planning. It's got survey and assessment and reporting stuff into it. It has its own app-based controls that you can load into the RC Pro or third-party Android tablets to control the drone. It automatically supports the Mavic 3 Enterprise using the RC Pro. Most drones are more processing only with Drone Deploy. So if you want to use it with the Mini 3 Pro, for example, You can fly the drone manually or using like the waypoints feature in the drone, but you won't be able to use Drone Deploy to say, just map this area for me automatically. Not inexpensive. It is a business-focused platform, so it starts at $330 US a month. Pix4D is another major platform. Again, it's both desktop and cloud-based, actually. There's Pix4D Capture, there's Pix4D React, there's Mapper, there's a whole bunch of different platforms for different use case scenarios. So both of these have like really diverse kind of broken down tiers of their system. The capture side of it is very similar to Drone Deploy. There is an app that you can install and run, but again, it's kind of a lot of these third-party ones right now with the way the SDKs are, they're moving more to processing only. So React is more for first responders and emergency scenarios. It's their lowest price option for building just a really quick and dirty map. It's $37 US a month. But they have aggregate survey, they have inventory management reporting. You can go right to CAD from their software as well. I've got more experience with Metashape. So this is Agisoft Metashape. It's a desktop-based platform. It runs on both Mac and PC. It's meant to process it all locally. There is cloud rendering available for it now, so you can offload your work. But it is more specific to just post-processing. There is some planning features in there, like you can figure out how many pictures you're going to need to do an area at a certain resolution. It's more of a platform for desktop use. There is a standard version that you can use that's single use. There is a lot of features in the Pro. So if you're doing multispectral, specifically 3D model management, then the Pro side is going to be more of an appeal. And then there's DJI Terra. DJI Terra is a cloud-based platform. It's built-in or has built-in management support with the DJI Enterprise drones. So the Mavic 3 Enterprise and then, of course, the Matrice series are going to have really strong integration with Terra. Terra has interfaces for sharing your work directly through the cloud to your end users. It's roughly $1,500 US per year. So it's actually a little more affordable than Drone Deploy. They've got some new cool features that came out. They have the ability to edit your maps in 3D modeling. And then another really good one that's kind of accessible for just getting started is Maps Made Easy. It's cloud-based. It does or did have an app that you could use to control your drone. It supports pretty much all of them, so enterprise and the consumer level, depending on the drone. It's pay-per-use or subscription-based, so you can buy a block of credits. They have a free tier that's 1 gigapixel per month. So that's 1,000 megapixels can be uploaded per month. If you do, let's say, a 1 acre plot in mapping, it might be, let's say it's 400 photos. Well, that's 400 times 20 megapixels. So that's 8,000. So now let's talk about some applications, Finn.
So the first one is just doing surveys of sites, or we mentioned before, the technical term for this is called remote sensing. Remote sensing can just be broadly defined as collecting any data where you're not standing there. So technically, when you're using a drone, you're not standing there because you're not the one holding the camera. It's something away from you that is collecting the data. So this could be used for construction planning, monitoring, agriculture, forestry, inspections, and solar. Aggregate monitoring. This is like if you can fly the drone over a yard that has inventory, and if you've got that big triangle of gravel, you can see how big the triangle is, and then in software you can use math and trigonometry to figure out the volume of that triangle pretty accurately.
Process of converting these images from a cluster of images into a 3D model, so photogrammetry, and then once you have that 3D model or a point cloud, which is a collection of 3D pixels, you can then measure the distance between those relative based on the GPS. So then it makes it very easy to figure out. You know where the surface is, what a flat surface is, and then what the volume of that is. It's volumetrics. Construction planning and monitoring, like the pre, during, and post side of it. Obviously, this is meant to augment traditional survey. That's a lot of walking. It's very time consuming. So you fire up a drone, you can go and do a quick top-down map and then geo-rectify that and then quickly start establishing a baseline and getting that intelligence or that information about the area right away. It may not replace the level of precision that you need for survey, because if you're working with something that's unique or hard to see or anything like that, of course you're going to need to augment it, but you've got that base image. And this could be done in 20 minutes, 30 minutes, and especially if you're using RTK and all the other advanced tools, you could have something processed in the cloud within an hour or two to the customer. So if they're calling from the boardroom and they need this information right now and surveyor's on another job, but you've got the drone here, at least you can get some information and it becomes actionable, right? That's the big thing, is this data is actionable. During construction, you can monitor progress by flying the exact same mission, let's say once a month or once a week. You can build a 3D time lapse of a project and then show that to all your investors, for example. This can be done with both like photos and time lapse, but also at a 3D level. Oh, and building inspections. We've got a couple examples here. So some examples of applications. A few years back, we did some multispectral mapping of a winery. Now, this has been colorized, but these images were actually 5 different bands of black and white images that were scanned all at once using mapping. And this is then turned in, is run through an algorithm to determine the health of the level of chlorophyll in the leaves, right? And by measuring the level of chlorophyll in the leaves, you get an idea of how healthy the plants are underneath. And you can start to look at this as trends over time and say, well, like, is there insufficient watering, or is there too much fertilization going on, or what's going on that might be affecting the plants? All the same, it's all a photo map. It's just using different bands of light to process and add some science to it.
And the term multispectral just refers to taking images that use more than just the visible light spectrum.
And really, like, it's all the same. Like, it's aerial data being used to either plan an action or react to something. Get a baseline image, right? So you have a scientific approach to something. No matter what it is, you get your established baseline, do some sort of change, and then you come back and measure it. And because we're using drones, because we're able to do this from an aerial perspective, we have that control that we can go in and look and see if something's working or not working.
Environmental management, you could, if there was a embankment on a river that you were concerned about erosion, you could fly the same mission over the river every 1 month.
Yeah.
And see if the bank is starting to erode.
Yeah, and like I think we also discussed in class, just watching the migration patterns of different animals. They do it a lot up like in northern BC next to Alaska. They watch how different like groups of deer actually go between the two places.
And of course, like, we haven't even talked about thermal today, but thermal mapping is still the same thing. It's just, again, a different sensor doing the same job. And one of the tips for thermal is obviously you want to do it at night so you get a true sense of the heat coming off of the building. So like we're talking about building inspection. So this is an example of both a 2D orthomosaic and then a 3D model from it. This was captured with a Mini. It works, and one of the reasons we use the Mini too is exactly what Finn was talking about. It was a public place. This is a major retail store. Very difficult to control the area. It wouldn't have been safe for us to run a bigger drone. The safest way to do it and be within the legal confines of what Canada allows us to do is to use a Mini too. So yeah, we captured, 150, 200 images using Drone Deploy. We then insert them into Drone Deploy's portal. It then takes the images and builds the orthomosaic on the left side. And then it also builds the 3D model on the right side, which is then measurable. So you could measure the roof line. You could measure the slope of the roof. We then went back and did the same job using a Matrice 30, and we did a thermal of the same building. So we had a thermal map at night showing hot spots and cold spots around the furnaces, and like any pooling water or anything like that would have been identified. So now they've got the ability to see the entire property and build an inventory. The entire project was probably done in the span of a few months. Another one similar, using digital surface maps. So this is showing you a heat map of elevation from a reference point. So let's assume dark blue is the lowest and bright green is the highest where these buildings are. This was a location where they were going to be building an extension onto this warehouse, and they wanted to know this green space, like where the terrain was for the waterway through there, because there was some environmental concerns. So this was using photogrammetry. So one thing photogrammetry doesn't do well is foliage. And so it's noise, essentially, because it can't measure and penetrate through trees, which is where LiDAR, if I were to scan this using LiDAR, I'd have a perfectly smooth surface model, and I would see the true elevation, whereas foliage can't do that. But you can see on the left side here, this is gravel that they'd excavated. So you can, if I were to turn this on its side, you could easily measure the volume of that gravel as well.
When someone calls me on the phone and asks me, what do I need to get into mapping? We always recommend people who want to use drones for work acquire an advanced certificate. You never want to have to turn down a job because you're only a basic pilot. And then if you're in the States, it's Part 107. If you're in Canada, we heavily recommend the advanced certificate.
Yeah, let's be clear. So in the States, it's mandatory because you're doing commercial venture. In Canada, it's not mandatory to have a basic or an advanced. And if you are going to do this with a Mini 3 Pro, if you're experimenting and learning the techniques and everything, you don't need either of these. But again, it's more about the knowledge.
The next step is the hardware. Now, one of the things when we were talking about the hardware is of the 3 aircraft we talked about, 2 of them were specialized pieces of equipment.
Yeah.
In the current trend in the drone space is that equipment is becoming more and more specialized. Yeah. Could potentially set you apart from the market if you had access to specialized equipment.
It will, for sure. There's obviously risk and reward. If you buy something that's too specialized, you might paint yourself into a niche corner that is rapidly iterating, but at the same time, it isn't. There's drones out there still that are very good for mapping that aren't in production anymore, like the Phantom 4 Pro V2. If you can get your hands on one of those, it's still a very good mapping drone, but it's hard to get batteries for them now because it's a dead platform in DJI's mind. Firmware issues might be a problem. Remote ID was going to be a problem, but it isn't now. So the Pro V2 is the one you want.
We even mentioned like the different types of Mavic 3s. Each one of those is for a specific thing. But ultimately, if you don't have the right tool for the job, you're going to have a hard time completing the job properly. The Mini, at the end of the day, it requires a little bit more technical like knowledge.
Fine for experimenting. Fine for something that is officially supported. If you can run an app that's officially supported, but if you're going out, you have a deadline, and you have a customer that has paid you or is going to pay you for this job, do not DIY this.
The job you can't complete because something weird happens with your Android tablet is the last job that you'll ever get.
And then for the software, there are some free options out there, right? So check out Maps Made Easy. There's a 30-day free trial for Metashape. I'm sure every other platform has some sort of trial. So just get out there and fly. The important thing is acquiring the images first, because it's the whole mantra of everything. It's garbage in, garbage out. So if you aren't consistent about how you capture the images, focus on just the techniques of flying. And that's where the Mini 3 is great for that, because you can do all that and control that. And then you can just dump those image sets into a mapping software and see what happens as a result. But also, if you haven't taken any of our courses, we offer some online drone training courses. So we have the Advanced Pilot Bundle for Canadians that includes everything you need to get ready for the online advanced exam, as well as complete the in-person flight review, which is a second part of the process. If you're looking to fly commercially in the States, we have a Part 107 course that is an online ground school that gets you ready for the in-person only test that you need to do in the States for the Part 107. And then we also have a course specific to mapping and geomatics. It's put together in-house, and then we partnered with Mike Moralato. He's a mapping professional that's been like all over Western Canada doing mapping. And it gets right into the weeds on this. So it covers RTK, drone settings, planning a mission. We have at least 2 case studies in there of doing post-processing using Metashape, and I think we did one in Pix4D as well of how to build maps. So there's some really good options out there in our platform for training.
So if there's no mapping questions, can I ask you an unmapping question?
Sure,
Go for it.
So I'm involved with CASARA, Civil Air Search and Rescue, and we use an M30T. And we're looking at equipment requirements for taskings, and I'm looking for a sunlight readable, weather resistant monitor that would be lightweight, low power, and so on. Probably 10 or 12 inches, something that's bigger than the RC Plus screen. And so far I haven't struck pay dirt. I'm wondering if you guys had any, like to be able to use this monitor for a spotter. It would basically be an HDMI cable plugged into the RC Plus going to this monitor. And then ideally it would be usable in either, bright direct sunlight or in mild to moderate precipitation.
Yeah, so a couple that come to mind. There's a brand called Atomos, Atomos. They make monitors for cinema production, but they're actually fairly affordable. So they make both monitors and then monitors with built-in recording capabilities as well. And they're battery powered and they have daylight, so like 2000 nits or brighter, and they'll take an HDMI input. And there's like a 12, there's a 17 or an 18-inch version, and then they'll have sun hoods as well. They're not cheap, but they are designed for on-set production use. So they're very durable and very rugged. There's another company called Lilliput. They make more like an affordable option, maybe not as bright, but again, like a lens hood is going to be one thing that's really important. If you can get a lens hood that either covers like the top 3/4 or all four, and then you just have like a box to view it in, that's going to make a lot of value there as well. If you're running it off of a vehicle, you could hard mount to the back of like an SUV, an outdoor TV with something that's like 2,000 or 3,000 nits of daylight use. Anything that's HDR capable though is going to have very high brightness and be in the, you're going to want something that's probably 2,000 nits or more and have some sort of anti-reflective coating on it. All right, so that concludes today's episode. Thanks again for watching us. And if you have any questions, of course, you can hit us up in the comments below. And be sure to like and subscribe. If you want to see an episode like this filmed live and join us and to have your questions answered in real time, then you got to join the Coastal community, and you can check that out at community.coastaldrone.co. Thanks for watching again, and we'll see you next week.